Tack and Coffee, A Soldier's Life in the Civil War is a classic memoir written by John D. Billings, first published in 1887. This engaging account provides a vivid and often humorous look into the daily lives of Union soldiers during the American Civil War. Billings, himself a veteran of the war, offers detailed descriptions of camp life, hardships, food, equipment, and the camaraderie shared among soldiers. This version has been adapted to suit the modern listener, ensuring its timeless stories and insights remain accessible and engaging today. If you enjoy this type of content, please like and subscribe. These are Billings' words. Let's begin. All in for your rations, Company A. My subject is Army rations. While much of what I describe may apply to all Union armies, my account specifically pertains to the Army of the Potomac, unless otherwise noted. There has long been a misconception about the quantity and quality of food provided to soldiers. I've often been asked whether I always had enough to eat in the Army. My answer, yes, has frequently surprised people. Some veterans might disagree and say they didn't have enough, but I would ask them how long their regiment ever went without food entirely. Apart from prisoners of war, who tragically starved by the thousands, most soldiers rarely went without food for more than 24 to 30 hours. Individual soldiers may have faced longer hunger spells if they were separated from their unit on an exposed picket post, rear guard duty, or similar assignments, but such cases were exceptions. Even during active operations, when the supply trains sometimes lagged behind, soldiers usually managed. If they expected delays, they rationed their supplies carefully or supplemented their meals with poultry or pork from the surrounding countryside. Southern hogs, unlike their northern counterparts, often roamed freely, scavenging for food. This led someone to quip, without disrespect to Southerners, that every other person on a Southern street is a hog. Indeed, pork was and remains a staple meat in the South. Regarding the quality of rations, the situation is less clear-cut. While issues with spoiled or substandard food were real, they were exceptions rather than the rule. Soldiers often complained about stale beef, known as salt horse, and rusty, unwholesome pork. Hardtack, the iconic Army biscuit, became a symbol of misery, often described as rock-hard and riddled with maggots. While such accounts are true to an extent, they have been exaggerated over time. For the most part, the government did well to provide soldiers with decent food under challenging circumstances. When bad rations were issued, it was often due to dishonest contractors or inspectors who conspired to profit by supplying inferior goods. These profiteers deserved the strongest condemnation, as they exploited the nation's needs during a time of great peril. The standard Army rations included salt pork, fresh beef, salt beef, occasional ham or bacon, hard bread, soft bread, potatoes, occasional onions, flour, beans, split peas, rice, dried apples, dried peaches, desiccated vegetables, coffee, tea, sugar, molasses, vinegar, candles, soap, pepper, and salt. Soldiers didn't receive all these items at once. Typically, they were issued one type of meat at a time, often pork. When hard bread was provided, there was no soft bread or flour, and when beans or peas were issued, there was no rice. A single daily ration consisted of 12 ounces of pork or bacon, or 1 pound 4 ounces of salt or fresh beef, 1 pound 6 ounces of soft bread or flour, or 1 pound of hard bread, or 1 pound 4 ounces of cornmeal. Additionally, every 100 rations included a peck of beans or peas, 10 pounds of rice or hominy, 10 pounds of green coffee or 8 pounds of roasted and ground coffee, or 1 pound 8 ounces of tea, 15 pounds of sugar, 1 pound 4 ounces of candles, 4 pounds of soap, 2 quarts of salt, 4 quarts of vinegar, 4 ounces of pepper, half a bushel of potatoes, when available, and 1 quart of molasses. Desiccated potatoes or compressed vegetables could be substituted for beans, peas, rice, or fresh potatoes. Dried fruits, pickles, and pickled cabbage were occasionally issued in small quantities to prevent scurvy. The marching ration was more limited: 1 pound of hard bread, 3/4 of a pound of salt pork, or 1 pound 4 ounces of fresh meat, along with sugar, coffee, and salt. Items like beans, rice, soap, and candles were omitted because soldiers couldn't carry them while on the move. If a unit stayed on the march until the end of the month, these unused portions of the rations were forfeited and reverted to the government. This was an injustice, as soldiers lost part of their allowance through no fault of their own, even as they gave their strength, and sometimes their lives, for the cause. Company commanders could request the monetary equivalent of these forfeited rations from the brigade commissary. The money, in theory, was meant to be distributed among the soldiers. However, many officers didn't bother with this, and those who did often failed to pay the soldiers. Few veterans ever recall seeing a penny from these so-called company funds. Officers fared better than enlisted men in camp. Instead of receiving rations directly, they were given a cash allowance to buy supplies from the brigade commissary. Their monthly ration allowances varied by rank. Colonels received 6 rations worth $56 and 2 servants. Lieutenant colonels received 5 rations worth $45 and 2 servants. Majors received 4 rations worth $36 and 2 servants. Captains received 4 rations worth $36 and 1 servant. First and second lieutenants shared an allowance similar to that of captains. Field officers also received allowances for horses and forage proportional to their rank. I will now describe the rations in more detail, beginning with hard bread, or as it was commonly known in the Army of the Potomac, hardtack. What was hardtack? It was a simple biscuit made from flour and water. I have 2 examples in my possession as mementos, each measuring 3 1/8 by 2 7/8 inches and nearly half an inch thick. Although hardtack was distributed to organizations by weight, it was handed out to soldiers by number, 9 biscuits per ration in some regiments, 10 in others. However, there was usually enough for those who wanted more since some men refused to draw their full share. While hardtack was nutritious, a hungry man could quickly eat his 10 biscuits and still feel unsatisfied. The biscuits often became the target of soldiers' wrath when they fell into one of 3 undesirable conditions. First, some hardtack was so hard it could not be bitten into. Breaking it required a strong fist, and even soaking it in liquid failed to make it soft. Instead, it developed a rubbery elasticity, much like gutta percha. Second, some hardtack became moldy or damp, making it unfit for consumption. This often happened because the biscuits were boxed too soon after baking or exposed to the elements. At supply depots and railway stations, thousands of boxes of hard bread could often be seen stacked outdoors with little to no shelter, allowing rain to spoil them. The failure of inspectors to do their duty contributed to the distribution of such damaged supplies. Third, and perhaps most dreaded, was hardtack infested with maggots or weevils. In my experience, weevils were more common than maggots. These tiny brown bugs, about 1/8 of an inch long, bored small holes throughout the biscuits. Fortunately, they did not seem to affect the hardest varieties. When the bread was moldy or damp, it was discarded and replaced at the next distribution, so the men did not lose out. However, if the biscuits were infested with insects, soldiers were usually stuck with them. It took a significant infestation, accompanied by webs and other telltale signs, for such supplies to be condemned. An exception comes to mind. 2 shipments of hardtack arrived at City Point but were found to be crawling with weevils. When this was reported to General Grant, he ordered that the shipments not be unloaded, much to the dismay of the contractor who had tried to pressure the inspector into passing the supplies. Quartermasters were not always diligent in addressing such issues, and when soldiers complained, the blame was often shifted to higher authorities until the true culprit could no longer be identified. Despite these shortcomings, hardtack was not as unpleasant as one might think, even when riddled with insects. In the dark, one could hardly tell the difference between infested and clean biscuits. It was common for soldiers to find weevils floating on the surface of their coffee after breaking up hardtack into it. The bugs would drown and could easily be skimmed off, leaving no noticeable flavor behind. Soldiers who preferred to rid their hardtack of pests beforehand could do so by heating the biscuits at a fire, which expelled the weevils but not the maggots. Most hardtack was produced in Baltimore and packed in 60-pound boxes, 50 pounds net weight. It is said that the storehouses where the biscuits were kept would quickly become infested with weevils, as the pests multiplied rapidly once they found their way into a single box. The soldiers found numerous ways to prepare hardtack, transforming this simple flour and water tile into more palatable dishes. Some men ate the biscuits plain, as issued. Many crumbled them into coffee, creating hardtack and coffee, a popular choice, especially for breakfast and supper. This method probably accounted for the majority of hardtack consumption. However, creative soldiers discovered other, more appetizing ways to use their hardtack. Many men, driven partly by necessity and partly by a growing interest in cooking, became skilled at preparing a surprising variety of dishes with minimal ingredients. Some soldiers would crumble hardtack into soups, using it as a thickener. For this purpose, it worked quite well. Others would soak hardtack in cold water, then fry the softened crumbs in meat juices and fat. A variation of this dish, known as skillygallee, involves soaking the hardtack in cold water and frying it until brown in pork fat, with salt added for taste. Though satisfying to some, it was notoriously heavy and indigestible. Toasting hardtack was another popular method, often done using the end of a split stick. If a piece fell into the campfire and became charred, it was still considered edible and even thought to be good for weak stomachs. Some soldiers made milk toast with condensed milk, a rare treat costing 75 cents a can. This luxury was generally reserved for recruits with large bounties, veterans with wealthy families, or re-enlisted men. A few soldiers saved their sugar rations to spread on hardtack for a sweeter meal. The versatile hardtack was also a key ingredient in lobscouse, a hodgepodge dish that combined various ingredients. Soldiers found countless ways to incorporate this simple yet essential food into their diets, showcasing their ingenuity in transforming a basic ration into diverse meals. One popular parody of the old song Hard Times captured the soldiers' sentiments about hardtack. Though I do not recall the full lyrics, the chorus went, "'Tis the song of the soldier, weary, hungry, and faint. Hardtack, hardtack, come again no more. Many days have I chewed you and uttered no complaint. O greenbacks, come again once more." This humorous tune likely evolved from another Army song, possibly originating during the hardships faced by the 1st Iowa Regiment before the Battle of Wilson's Creek in 1861. During that time, they were issued a poor quality of hard bread, not yet known as hardtack. One soldier composed a lament that went, "Let us close our game of poker. Take our tin cups in our hand, while we gather round the cook's tent door, where dry mummies of hard crackers are given to each man. O hard crackers, come again no more." Chorus. "'Tis the song and sigh of the hungry. Hard crackers, come again no more. Many days have you lingered upon our stomachs sore. O hard crackers, come again no more." This song resonated with the soldiers' plight and was even said to have inspired General Lyon to order a change in their rations, replacing hard bread with cornmeal mush. In response, the song was altered to reflect this new hardship. But to groans and to murmurs, there has come a sudden hush. Our frail forms are fainting at the door. We are starving now on horse feed that the cooks call mush. O hard crackers, come again once more. Chorus. It is the dying wail of the starving. Hard crackers, come again once more. You are old and very wormy, but we pass your failings o'er. O hard crackers, come again once more. Interestingly, the term hardtack was not widely used among soldiers in the Western armies. The other bread ration, soft bread or loaves, offered a welcome change. Early in the war, soldiers received flour uncooked, but the allowance of 18 ounces often exceeded their needs, as many supplemented their meals with other food sources. Some units obtained semi-cylindrical ovens, set in stone, for regimental bakers to prepare fresh bread. However, these practices were phased out as the war progressed, and the government centralized bread production for efficiency. At one point in 1861, the vaults beneath the western terrace of the Capitol were converted into bakeries, producing 16,000 loaves daily. The oven's chimneys protruded through the terrace, emitting thick black smoke for months. Bread for the Army of the Potomac was primarily baked in Washington, Alexandria, and Fort Monroe, with the latter facility capable of producing 30,000 loaves a day. Despite this capacity, brigade commissaries often constructed their own ovens near depots to meet demand. When the Army reached Petersburg, logistical challenges made fresh bread harder to supply. General Grant quickly resolved this by ordering ovens built at City Point, where citizen bakers worked day and night. These ovens produced 123,000 loaves daily, often delivered warm to the soldiers. Although soft bread was a treat, many soldiers grew tired of it more quickly than hardtack. Sailors and those accustomed to life at sea, in particular, preferred hardtack. Jeffersonville, Indiana, served as a key hub for supplying bread to Western armies. Bread was undoubtedly a crucial ration for soldiers, though some veterans might argue that coffee was even more important. Coffee, however, was a stimulant providing temporary energy, while bread offered the essential nutrition to sustain a soldier's strength and rebuild his body. Regardless of opinions on other rations, the government-issued coffee was universally praised for its quality. The rations may have been small, and sometimes the commissary or quartermaster might have provided a short allowance, but what we did receive was good. At times, it felt like a perfect godsend. Many times, after being completely exhausted by a night march, a common experience for thousands of soldiers, I would wash up, if water was available, make and drink a pint or so of coffee, and feel as refreshed as if I had just woken from a full night's sleep. At such moments, nothing else could have served as an adequate substitute. It would have been fascinating for a civilian to observe how these rations were distributed when the army was on active duty. Typically, the coffee ration was brought to camp in oat sacks. The regimental quartermaster would receive and divide the supply among the 10 companies, while the quartermaster sergeant of a battery divided his share among 4 or 6 detachments. Then, the orderly sergeant of a company or the detachment sergeant would take charge of dividing it further. One common method involved spreading a rubber blanket on the ground, sometimes more than one if the company was large, and placing as many piles of coffee on it as there were men to receive rations. Great care was taken to ensure that all piles were of equal size to avoid complaints, much like a country doctor carefully measuring out powders. The sugar that accompanied the coffee was spooned out onto another blanket. Once ready, the rations were distributed, with each man collecting a pile. In some companies, to avoid accusations of unfairness, the sergeant would turn his back while someone else pointed to a pile and asked, "Who shall have this?" The sergeant, without looking, would call out a name from the company roll, and the designated soldier would claim the pile. This process continued until all piles were taken. Though other methods were used, this one was quite common. Once each soldier had his coffee and sugar ration, he would store it in his own way. A soldier with just a month of experience in the field often used a paper to wrap his coffee and stored it in his haversack, where it would quickly mix with hardtack, salt pork, pepper, and other items, creating a messy jumble. A slightly more experienced soldier might use a scrap of rubber blanket or poncho to make a bag. However, the rubber often peeled, or the poncho paint rubbed off, leaving the coffee in a sticky mess and the bag unusable. Occasionally, a young soldier with a touch of pride would have a bag lined with oil silk, perhaps made by his mother and sent from home. Even these didn't last long, as the rugged conditions in the haversack quickly ruined them. The seasoned veteran, having learned from hard experience, typically used a plain cloth bag, though it was often as dirty as a coal heaver's shirt. He would scoop both sugar and coffee into this bag and mix them together. This method had its advantages. It prevented the sugar from being wasted or lost, which often happened when kept separate. It might melt in the rain, get wet, or be used up too quickly, leaving future cups of coffee unsweetened. Some soldiers managed to keep sugar and coffee separate, storing them in different parts of the same bag and rationing them proportionally. Milk was a rare luxury. Soldiers quickly adapted to drinking coffee without it. Condensed milk, sold under brands like Lewis and Borden, was sometimes available from sutlers when they were nearby. Early in the war, soldiers occasionally milked stray cows directly into their canteens, but as the conflict wore on, the number of cows dwindled. Many were used for beef, leaving only those kept hidden away by Southern families who relied on them for sustenance and labor. When the army settled in camp, company cooks usually prepared the rations. These cooks were chosen from among the soldiers, often because they had a knack for or an interest in cooking. If no one volunteered, cooking duty rotated among the men. The cook's role was a coveted position, as it exempted them from other duties. At mealtime, soldiers would line up single file at the cookhouse or open fire. Using a long-handled dipper, the cook would fill each soldier's tin cup with coffee and distribute the rest of the meal. The coffee prepared by company cooks was often of poor quality. It paled in comparison to what the soldiers made for themselves. Early in their service, most soldiers used their standard-issue tin dipper, which held between a pint and a quart, to boil coffee. However, the dipper's tendency to tip over and spill coffee into the fire, either from burning coals or clumsy movements, made it impractical. If the fire was blazing, retrieving a fallen dipper often meant enduring burns, and much of the coffee would be lost before it could be saved. This led to frustration and ill tempers. Over time, soldiers replaced the dipper with a simple solution, a pint or quart can from preserved foods, with a wire bale fashioned for easy handling. These makeshift coffee pots were durable and easily replaceable, as canned goods were common among officers and hospitals. The soldiers' coffee consumed became as black as coal, both inside and out, from constant use over open flames. Each man also carried a small tin cup for drinking coffee or water. This humble setup became the quintessential coffee kit of the private soldier. The coffee ration was highly valued by soldiers. When exhausted and footsore, a soldier might drop out of the marching column, build a small campfire, prepare his coffee, take a brief nap behind the nearest shelter, and then hurry to catch up with his company. While such men were sometimes called stragglers, the term carried no negative connotation in these circumstances. Tea, on the other hand, was so rarely issued that it hardly merits mention. By the latter part of the war, it was seldom seen outside of hospitals. One of the most remarkable scenes in army life occurred at night when the army prepared to bivouac. As soon as word spread that the column was stopping, each soldier would grab a rail from the nearest fence and carry it to the designated camping ground. In what seemed like no time at all, countless small campfires would spring up, illuminating the hills and plains like magic. Soldiers would gather around these fires, almost invariably brewing coffee first. Many, worn out from the day's march, would have a simple supper of hardtack and coffee before rolling up in their blankets to sleep. Even if a midnight march was ordered, a pot of coffee often preceded it. Similarly, any halt in mid-morning or afternoon was marked by brewing coffee, usually accompanied by hardtack. It was a constant presence, at meals, between meals, and during all hours of the night for those on or off guard duty. Many old soldiers who endured those times remain habitual coffee drinkers to this day. At one point during the war, speculators attempted to corner the coffee market, forcing the government to pay exorbitant prices for its supply. However, United States agents in England were promptly instructed to purchase several shiploads anchored in the English Channel. The transaction was successfully completed, collapsing the coffee corner. There was also an incident involving a coffee bid. When the government sought proposals for supplying coffee to the army, a New York importer named Sawyer had already submitted a bid but later realized he could offer a lower price. Approaching the official in charge, likely General Joseph H. Eaton, Sawyer asked if he could submit a revised bid. Though the initial bids had been opened, no contracts had yet been awarded, so Eaton allowed it. Sawyer's new bid proved the lowest, and the government promptly purchased not only the requested amount but also all the coffee his firm had in stock at the same rate. To Sawyer's dismay, his initial bid had also been the lowest. His ambition to undercut himself saved the government thousands of dollars but left him enraged at his own misstep. Army regulations stipulated that soldiers were entitled to 3/4 of a pound of pork or bacon, or 1 1/4 pounds of fresh or salted beef. When the army expected to remain in one place for an extended period, company cooks typically handled the preparation of rations. However, practices varied, with each company commander deciding how to organize meals. Early in the war, when regiments were still relatively inexperienced, designated cooks prepared meals unless the unit was immediately sent into active service. In state camps, soldiers often had access to food from home or local vendors, so army rations were less appreciated. Fresh meat, when handled by company cooks, was usually boiled. Rarely, cooks might attempt to broil steak or prepare roast beef in ovens, though the limited amount of high-quality cuts meant such efforts often fell short. Occasionally, soups were made, but boiling remained the standard preparation. Soldiers frequently preferred receiving raw meat rations, which allowed them to prepare meals to their liking. Complaints about company cooks often revolved around suspicions that the best portions were reserved for the cooks or officers. In some cases, these suspicions were well-founded. When raw meat was distributed, its use depended on its quality. Tough, stringy cuts were often stewed with whatever ingredients were available, such as garlic or wild onions. Better cuts were broiled on coals or a flame, impaled on ramrods or sticks. This method, favored by experienced campaigners, was both efficient and flavorful. Frying required a pan, an extra burden many soldiers chose to forego. However, those who carried fry pans, often lightweight and purchased from sutlers, used them to prepare meals. Improvised alternatives, such as flattened canteen halves or tin plates, were also common. Despite the challenges, fresh meat was a welcome break from the monotony of salt pork or boiled meat. Salted beef, often derisively called salt horse, was rarely issued except in stationary camps. Strongly preserved with saltpeter, it was frequently discolored, unappetizing, and carried a stench that made it deeply unpopular. Soldiers sometimes joked about its poor quality, staging mock funerals before discarding it into the company sinks. When consumed, it required extensive soaking to remove the salt, with some soldiers tying it to cords and leaving it in streams overnight. Salt pork was the staple meat ration, indispensable despite its shortcomings. While company cooks usually boiled it, soldiers preferred to broil it over flames or eat it raw between slices of hardtack. It was also a key ingredient in soups, stews, and beans. Although some pork was rancid or stringy, it was often the most reliable protein available. Occasionally, the ration included ham or bacon, though these were usually of poor quality, strong, rusty, and unappealing. Despite the hardships of camp life and the uneven quality of rations, soldiers found ways to make do, often displaying remarkable ingenuity in preparing their meals and making the best of what they were given. The bean ration played a vital role in sustaining the army and was, without question, one of the most appreciated food supplies. Company cooks typically stewed the beans with pork. When the pork was of good quality and the stew or soup was properly cooked without burning, a rare combination, the result was a palatable dish. Sometimes, soldiers built stone ovens on the ground surface to bake the beans in mess pans or kettles. However, the most popular method by far was baking them in the ground. This approach was almost universally adopted when beans were distributed for self-preparation. The process was as follows: a hole was dug large enough to accommodate a mess pan or kettle with space around it. The bottom of the hole was lined with a flat stone if one was available. A fire was then built in the hole and kept burning for several hours while the beans were prepared for baking. Once ready, the coals were shoveled out, and the kettle of beans and pork was placed inside. A board covered the top of the kettle, and the coals were shoveled back around it. Poles or boards were laid across the hole, covered with a piece of sacking or other material to keep dirt out, and then a mound of earth was piled over everything. By morning, when the hole was reopened, the result was a delicious and satisfying dish that became a treasured highlight for soldiers. Compared to baked beans back home, these seemed unbeatable. Since it was impractical to bake a single ration of beans using this method, tent crews often pooled their allowances or formed small groups of half a dozen men to cook collectively in a mess kettle. When the baked beans were unearthed early in the morning, no stockholder in this culinary joint stock company would miss roll call. Each man was ready with a plate or coffee dipper to claim his portion. Here is a post-war jingle, set to the tune of the Sweet By and By, that conveys the fondness veterans still felt for this cherished dish. The Army Bean. There's a spot that the soldiers all love. The mess tent's the place that we mean. And the dish we best like to see there is the old-fashioned, white army bean. Chorus. 'Tis the bean that we mean. And we'll eat as we narrate before. The army bean, nice and clean. We'll stick to our beans evermore. Boiled potatoes were occasionally provided when the army was in settled camp. On the march, soldiers often fried them for variety. Onions were a rare treat, at least in my company, but they were highly prized whenever they made an appearance, usually fried. Split peas were distributed less frequently. They were stewed with pork to make pea soup, sometimes called peas on a trencher. However, even when well cooked, pea soup was not particularly popular. When burned, as often happened, it became a universally disliked dish. Dried apples were issued by the government, humorously described as being intended to swell the ranks of the army. They were typically stewed and served as a sauce for hardtack. Occasionally, dried peaches were provided instead, but their poor quality often made the apples, despite their imperfections, a more favorable option. At rare intervals, boiled rice appeared on the menu, typically served with a small ration of molasses. The rice was almost always burned in cooking, a standard misstep of company cooks. Desiccated vegetables were another occasional ration. These came in small blocks, about an ounce in weight and a few inches in size, resembling kiln-dried sheets of mixed vegetables compressed into a dense form. When soaked, these blocks expanded significantly, revealing layers of cabbage leaves, turnip tops, sliced carrots, turnips, parsnips, and the faintest hint of onion. However, much of the material was indigestible and added little value to the diet. Soldiers mockingly referred to this ration as desecrated vegetables. I once heard of the 32nd Massachusetts Infantry receiving a ration of 300 boxes of strawberries, but such luxuries were exceedingly rare. I doubt many other regiments ever had a similar experience. The so-called whiskey ration was not a true ration. It was supplied only on rare occasions, usually by order of the medical department during extreme conditions like cold rainstorms or after arduous service. My company received whiskey no more than 3 or 4 times throughout the war. The quantity issued varied significantly across organizations. While private soldiers generally drank in moderation, some officers indulged more freely, occasionally jeopardizing their command during critical moments. It was a troubling reality that drunkenness among officers, as well as soldiers, could compromise leadership and even endanger lives during battle. Finally, I must comment on the inadequacy of the marching ration. Soldiers on the move were entitled to 1 pound of hard bread and 1¼ pounds of fresh or salt beef daily, along with sugar, coffee, and salt. This was insufficient for the demands of active service. A larger ration, perhaps 1½ pounds of bread and meat, would have been more appropriate, compensating for the parts of the ration not issued and preventing soldiers from consuming multiple days' rations in advance. By neglecting this, the Army often faced shortages that required adjustments to rations in camp, though the men were rarely informed of these issues. Where ignorance is bliss, indeed. That concludes the 4th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.